Welcome to the Appalachian Heritage Woodshop, woodworking with an Appalachian flair.
This is Jerill with the Appalachian Heritage Woodshop. I want to show you how I monitor moisture content loss in the kiln that I have. Many of you know I have a kiln and I dry my own hardwood. Shortly after I got my degree in woodworking, I applied for and was awarded a grant through the West Virginia Cultural Center and National Endowment for the Arts. And that grant paid for 2/3 of the cost of the construction of the kiln. Now I drive for myself and I also drive for others in about a 5-county area. So what I wanted to do was show you how I go about obtaining the samples for the kiln. But before I do that, I want to explain why I do the oven dry method instead of a moisture meter. The U.S. Forestry Service has a research lab and they've conducted the research, compiled the data, and they've written the kiln operator's manual. So if you wonder where the information comes from, that is where it comes from. They recommend the oven dry method as opposed to a meter, and there's several reasons. The oven dry method is a scientific method. It is repeatable. It gives you the same results over and over, no matter who does it, and that's because it's a scientific method. It is the only method that is accepted in a court of law because it is scientific. A meter is not a scientific method and it is not accepted in a court of law. And the reason is there are way too many variables, and when you use a meter, you do not always get the same results. It is not consistent. The sample board needs to be a representative board of what you have placed in the kiln. If you have some number 2 common and some select in the kiln, and you take your sample from the number 2 common, it's not going to be representative of the way the select dries. So it needs to represent whatever is in the kiln. If you have quarter sawn white oak in the kiln and you have a couple of boards, white oak, that are not quarter sawn, and you take your samples out of the ones that are not quarter sawn, it is not representative of what is in the kiln. So I have customers come to me, I drive for other customers. I have them come to me, and when I load the kiln, they want to take the worst board they have and cut it up and use it for samples. And that is not a representative sample of what's in the kiln. So I select one that is very, very similar to the majority of the wood in the kiln. And I prefer 2 or 3 boards, but today I'm only going to use one to show you how to cut one. This is white oak. As you can see, most of the wood that went into the kiln was about 10 to 12 inches wide, and all of it was about 6 foot long. It's good quality wood, so I selected this board on purpose for a couple of reasons. If you notice down here, there's a check in the end of the board. I've also got a knot here, which is considered a defect. Up here, I've got a knot and a knot over here, and then I've got a sticker stain here. This board has air dried for 2 years, so now I'm going to put it in the kiln and finish drying it the rest of the way. So what I want to do is cut my samples that do not include any of those defects. Now the U.S. Forestry Service recommends that when you cut your samples, you come in from the end a minimum of 6 inches. And I prefer to come in more than that. If you notice on this end, there is a check that comes in about 3 inches. So what I want to do is come in from the end of the check, not from the end of the board, a minimum of 6 inches. That gets me past that knot, and I'm going to come just past this sticker stain. So I'm going to cut somewhere in there. And this sticker stain, I'm going to cut on this side of it, and this side. And then down here, I'm going to stay on this side of the knot, and I've got a little bit of grain change right here. So I'm going to stay on this side of where the grain changes. So that has given me a piece here that is about 34 inches, and here a piece that is about 32 inches. Now, I work with my clients when I cut my samples, and by that I mean I try to make it so they can use the sample boards. If the client has the intention of building cabinets with the wood, and I cut boards that are, say, 18 inches long, they may not be long enough for his stiles or rails. So I try to work with them and cut it so that they can use the sample boards for whatever it is they're going to do. In this case, the client is my brother, and he does not have any particular plans for this, so I'm going to cut the sample boards as large as I can. The other thing you need to remember is, since we are weighing these boards, you need to make sure that the weight of your sample does not exceed the capacity of the scales that you're using. So now that I've marked where to cut these, I'm going to take this over to my cutoff saw and make these cuts. And then I'll come back and discuss cutting the sample out of the sample board. Okay, I've got my board here at my cutoff saw. I'm going to go ahead and cut it at my marks. Now you can see how good the boards look. I'll take these back over to my workbench and explain to you how I cut the oven dry sample out of the kiln sample. So now I've cut my samples that go in the kiln. Each sample that goes in a kiln needs a corresponding sample that I put in the oven and dry all the way down to 0% moisture content. Now, this batch of white oak was cut 5/4, which is 1.25 inches thick. Now, when you cut an oven dry sample out of your kiln sample, it should be about as wide as it is thick. You want it close to that. So because of that, I'm just going to use a square, and the tongue on my square is 1.5 inches, which is going to be close enough. So I'm going to mark that and label that number 1 and label this number 1. And I will do the same thing with this one. Label this one number 2, and this one number 2. Now, when I'm drying a batch of lumber in my kiln, I prefer to have at least 4 to 6 samples, and that would be a sample out of a board. So that would be 4 to 6 boards I would have samples from. Here, I'm taking 2 samples from the same board just so you will see how it's done. So now that I've got my oven dry sample marked, I need to take it over to the cutoff saw and cut it, and then I'll show you how I weigh it. Now let's go back over to my workbench and I'll show you how I'll weigh these and record the data. Okay, now that I've cut my oven dry samples out of the kiln samples, I want to show you how I weigh them and record the data. Before I do that, I always look at the ends and look and see if there's any slivers or any loose grain, and I remove that, because if I weigh it now and then as it dries it falls off, it gives you a false loss of weight. So now that I've done that, I'm ready to weigh the oven dry samples. Now these should be weighed as quickly as possible after you cut them, and the reason being, you are exposing fresh end grain, and the moisture escapes from the end grain very rapidly, so you don't want to let these sit around any longer than necessary before you weigh them. So sample number 1, I turn my scales on and let it go through the self-diagnostic and set it on there, and that one weighs 251 grams, and I'm going to write that down. And then my other sample, number 2, weighs 260 grams. Now I also need to weigh the samples that go in my kiln. And again, make sure I got all of the loose slivers off from where I cut it. Okay, number 1, 5,706 grams. Now then, number 2, 5101. Now my kiln samples I will take and place in the kiln, and then I open my kiln up every other day and weigh the samples. The U.S. Forestry Service recommends you open it every day and weigh the samples. I dry at a much slower rate than the maximum rate that is recommended by the U.S. Forestry Service. And that's why I only open my kiln every other day. So I'm going to go put these in the kiln. My oven dry samples, I will take them up to the house and I will finish drying these down to 0% moisture content in my oven, and I'll show you how that's done. Okay, I've had the samples in the oven. Now I'm ready to take them out and weigh them. Anytime I'm drying wood in the oven, I go ahead and bake a cake at the same time. Of course, the cake requires the temperature to be about 350 for about 20 to 30 minutes. Then I set the temperature down to 250. If you remember, water boils about 212, so any temperature above 212 is what you want, and I use 250. So what I do, turn the scales on and let it go through its self-diagnostic check, put them on there, weigh them, and I'll record that weight on the sample log sheet. And once I've done that, I put them back in the oven, and I do that once an hour until the weight stabilizes. The weight will gradually drop down, and then all at once it will stop dropping and be very stable. And that's when it will be dry at 0% moisture content. Now what I do is I open the kiln every other day and I weigh the samples, and these plots right here are the samples. The red is the kiln temperature, and you can see I took it up and then we had a cold spell and it dropped. The green is the humidity, and you can see it going down. The purple is the cost, where I have the kilowatt meter on the kiln. The blue is the number of days, and then these are the samples, and for this one I had 8 samples, and it started at 14% and I ended at 7.9% moisture content. So this is what my client gets, so he knows that the wood is being dried and the conditions. So I hope this has helped you to understand the oven dry method for measuring moisture in wood. So for those of you that operate a kiln, I highly encourage you to use the oven dry method. Please refer to the U.S. Forestry Service Kiln Operator's Manual for more information on that. For those of you that purchases kiln dried lumber, be sure and ask, was the material kiln dried? You know, construction lumber is kiln dried also, but it's only dried to about 18 to 20%. So you need to ask, was it kiln dried? You know, what kind of kiln did they use? What was their control method? But most importantly, how did they measure the moisture content in the wood? How did they monitor the moisture loss? If they can't answer those questions, then maybe you should go elsewhere when you buy kiln dried wood. A good operator, a good kiln operator, will show you the information, whether it be the log sheets, or whether it be a graph, or even give you a small tour of his kiln. So be sure and ask questions, and that'll help you understand the best and only scientific way of measuring moisture in wood, the oven dry method. This is Jerill Vance with the Appalachian Heritage Wood Shop reminding you, be proud of your Appalachian heritage.